I want to thank Evan and Misi for sharing their story, and I believe it's really fitting for the passage that we find ourselves in today. In John chapter 11, Jesus does something remarkable, but it begins with people finding themselves in a situation that has pushed them to their limits. And so let me ask you this morning, have you ever been in a situation where you've been pushed to the brink, you've been pushed to your limits, you are in over your head, things just seem too big for you? Like Evan and Misi, your hopes were dashed by life's trials. I don't know about you, but I know that I've been in similar situations, and life, we know, is great, but life is also full of problems, isn't it? Things come into our world that we don't expect. Things come into our world that we don't see. And so what do we do when those problems arise? Our passage today begins with a huge problem, a problem that we all face, and that is the problem of death. In our passage, someone close to Jesus was facing death. This was a friend of Jesus, and time was of the essence. And this is what it says in John 11, starting in verse 1. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. Now, we don't know why Lazarus was ill. We don't know what he was dealing with, but we know that it was so serious, only Jesus could fix it. And I just want to point that out. Sometimes in our lives, there are problems and challenges that are too big, too mighty. Only God could step in. Only God has the power to turn things around, because things may feel over our head, but all things are under Jesus' feet. Do you guys believe that this morning? He has power. The problem that Jesus wasn't around. His friend Lazarus was dying, but Jesus was in another town. So the sisters, verse 3, sent messengers saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill, your buddy Lazarus, he's ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It's for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, although those words probably comforted them on the surface, they had no clue what was about to happen. All they knew was that Lazarus needed help, and time was of the essence. And if Jesus didn't come soon, then all hope would be lost. So what does Jesus do? Well, we read that Jesus loved Martha. He loved Mary. He loved Lazarus, so he left immediately. Does your Bible say that? No, it doesn't say that, right? What it actually says is he loved them, and when he heard Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Wait, what? Jesus, your friend is perishing. No doctor's gonna help. No one is there. They are looking to you. You are the only one. We've seen your miracles. We've seen your power. This is your buddy. What are you gonna do? Jesus, someone you love is dying. They need you immediately. What do you mean 2 more days? What they didn't know was that based on the timeline, Jesus' friend Lazarus was already dead. Jesus, being all-knowing, knew that his friend had already passed. The messengers didn't. Still, they expected him to come in haste, because in their mind, it was life or death, which leads to part 2 of the story, and that is the postponement. Why did Jesus postpone? Why did Jesus procrastinate? Earlier, Jesus said that the illness would lead to the glory of God, and this statement reveals something important about pain, important about heartache, important about life's trials, and it's this: although God can speak to us at any time, he often shouts to us in our pain. Would you guys agree with that? God is with us at all times. He's with us in the highs. He's with us in the lows. He's with us when life is exciting, when life is boring, when everything's working out and when everything isn't. He is there at all times. But when things are going well, we often feel that we are okay and we don't quite need God that badly. But when things are tough, that's when he speaks the loudest. That's when he shouts in our ears. C.S. Lewis says, pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasure, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. Pain is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And Jesus was about to use the tragedy of death to rouse a deaf world. In fact, what we are here today to celebrate is the fact that the tomb is empty. Yes, Jesus hung upon a cross, and yes, Jesus was placed inside of a tomb, and he remained there for 3 days. But the story doesn't end with tragedy. The story ends with power and glory as Jesus Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Sometimes God uses hard things to shout his power and glory. And so 4 days later, 4 days later, Jesus arrived on the scene. Verse 17, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been there in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out and met him. But Mary, she remained seated in the house. And I just want to pause here for a moment and ask a challenging question, something you may have wrestled through in your life at some point in time. And the question is this: have you ever questioned God's timing? God, where are you? When are you coming? I remember talking to Evan and Misi when they called and they said, hey, we got this news and we don't know what's going to happen to our twins. We've been waiting for years to be parents, and now our twins are in this spot and we don't know what to do except to reach out and ask for prayer. And we don't understand why these things are happening and why God's timing is working this way, but we must believe and trust. And I remember visiting them in the hospital when Dalen and Brooks were born. And I remember seeing Evan as he spent some of his last moments with his son. And I remember being there at the graveside in Lemoore doing one funeral for one baby that didn't make it, and then also hearing updates about what's happening at Valley Children's Hospital for another child that was a miracle of life. God did the impossible. It didn't work out how they wanted things to work out. But God was still moving in a way they never comprehended, they never could understand. God's timing wasn't making sense, but God was still there. In John 11, the onlookers questioned Jesus' timing. If only you were here. If only you'd come as soon as we sent for you. If only you cared a little bit more. What if onlys have you told yourself? Now, I know that this is kind of a deep topic, especially for an Easter sermon. In fact, I was telling people I was preaching this topic and sharing some of this today, and they're like, are you crazy at Easter? Like, isn't that the time it's like rainbows and butterflies and unicorns, like all the fun stuff, like fuzzy feelings? But here's the reality. The reason I want to preach this passage is because I know that I'm talking to a group of people who, although they've seen many good things in their lives, I know you've also experienced pain. And what I want you to know today is that God sees you. God hears you. And what we do here on Sundays and what we do here at this church, it actually applies to your life, and God will give you resurrection power in the face of trials and challenges. Nothing is too big for God. Even when it fills over your head, it is all under his feet. My grandpa, he was a pastor. And I actually wasn't raised in a Christian home. My mom divorced my father, and she got remarried to the son of a pastor. That was my first time learning about Jesus. I remember learning from my grandpa and wondering, like, man, I don't know how I feel about all this stuff. Like, this is all new to me. And for many years, I just ignored it. I didn't believe any of it. And then I finally recognized my need for Jesus, and I bowed my knee, and my life was radically changed. And then all of a sudden, I was curious about what my grandpa had to say. I started wanting to meet with him and hear what he had to say. And he would often say this, and something you've probably heard before, and it's this reality that God is rarely early, but he's always on time. Would you guys agree with that? He's rarely early, but he's always on time. Lazarus' friends and family believed that Jesus was too late. What they didn't know was that 4 days was actually significant to Jesus. There was this well-known Jewish belief that a soul would depart a person on the 4th day. And so Jesus delayed because although Lazarus was already dead, he wanted everyone to know that Lazarus was dead, completely dead. Because Jesus was about to do something incredible. No one could deny it. No one could write it off as a hoax. They were about to witness a real display of the power of God. But before we get to the miracle, I want to share a quick application with you this morning, and it's this: God's delay is often for his display. Although Jesus might not come immediately when you want him, he will always be there for you exactly when you need him. Sometimes, as followers of Christ, we wait. And we worship in the waiting, and we have faith in the waiting, and the trials might feel like they're pressing in, but God is right there with us, speaking to us, reminding us of his power over the grave, his power over the natural order of things, and he encourages us to trust in the waiting and to remember that there is no need in our lives that Jesus Christ cannot meet. Do you believe that this morning? Our lives are so well cared for by Jesus. He goes before us to guide us. He walks behind us to protect us. He comes beside us to encourage and comfort us. When we stray, he brings us back. When we stumble, he picks us up. When we struggle, he carries us forward. When we slow down, he urges us on. He is a good shepherd who is always there for his sheep, especially when they need him most. And so will you keep believing even in the waiting? Although Martha and Mary kept believing, it was a half-hearted faith. You ever been there before? I kind of believe, but I kind of don't. But I help my unbelief. I want to follow you. I want to trust you, but it's a little much. Martha, verse 21, said to Jesus, "Lord, if only you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day." This response was half-hearted. It was half faith, half doubt. They were talking to the Son of God, the author of life. Mary's response was similar. Now Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, and she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if only you'd been here, if only my brother would not have died." They didn't fully trust the Lord. They attempted to limit God's power, God's strength, God's glory, which leads to the final section, the good news of this tear-jerking story, this heartfelt experience, and that is the power. It's in this context, the context of a great tragedy, that Jesus utters the greatest words in the entire Bible. He says these words, and these are the words that are part of the reason we're gathering here today, this Easter morning. This passage is, in my mind, one of the most relevant Easter passages in all of Scripture. Jesus says to them, in their mourning, in their hurting, in their pain, he looks at them in the eyes, and he says, "I am the resurrection and the life." Whoever, it's everybody, anybody, whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? You see, every generation since the dawn of mankind has struggled with the finality of the grave. And in fact, in Western society, death is often shrouded with mystery and with superstition. We want to ignore it, and it frightens us, and it's overwhelming. But we need to be reminded today of the hope of Easter, the hope that Jesus Christ is, in fact, resurrection. He didn't say that he provides resurrection, but that he actually is resurrection. He is the great I am, the one who was, the one who is to come. He holds the keys to death and life. He is in charge of it all. He gave your spirit, your body life, and he can resurrect your soul and bring you into his presence forever, just as he resurrected his own body from the grave. He's the author of life. I am resurrection. In fact, 8 times in the book of John, Jesus uses this statement, I am. It's about his eternality. He was and is to come. And he's already revealed what he is. He's the giver of life. Materially, he gives water to wine, turns water to wine. Spiritually, he offers the new birth to Nicodemus and the soul-satisfying water, living water at the woman at the well. He physically imparts life to a dying boy and a paralytic and a man born blind. He also is the good shepherd who comes to provide the abundant life for his sheep. And now he promises the indestructible life of the resurrection. But here's my question. If Jesus promises life, then why do we mourn in the face of death? We mourn because death is not natural. Death is a foreign invader. God's good created order. This passage, in fact, provides an interesting glimpse of Jesus' own view of death. When Jesus finally arrives on the scene 4 days later, he walks up. People are weeping and wailing and crying. A stone has been placed over the tomb of Lazarus. And when Jesus saw those he loved weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved, and his spirit was greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid Lazarus?" And then they said to him, "Lord, come and see." And when Jesus saw the sight, and when he saw his friends, and when he saw the pain of grief, Jesus wept. It's the shortest verse in the entire Bible. He wept. When Evan and Misi faced their battle of life and death, Jesus wept. When you face challenges that crush you to the core, when you feel like life is over your head, Jesus weeps. And he cries real tears, and he felt real pain. And this is mind-blowing because in most religions, the gods, they're apathetic to human beings. They don't get us because they've never been us, but Jesus gets you. Jesus took on flesh. He put on these broken bodies. And he experienced firsthand what it was like to walk on this fragile earth. He knew what it was like to be tired. Anybody tired this morning? Okay, he knew what it was like to be tempted to fall asleep in a sermon. You better not do that, okay? I'm watching you. He knew what it was like to be hungry, stressed, and anxious, even angry, and sick, and homeless. He often didn't have a place to lay his head. He often went through life just relying on the daily bread of the Father. He knows what it's like to be tempted. He knows what it's like to experience the grief and the anger associated with loss. He knows what it's like to weep in the face of death. And that's why twice the passage says that he was deeply moved. In the Greek, it actually speaks to his anger. Okay, Jesus does get angry. He gets angry at sin. He gets angry at Satan. He gets angry at death. He was angry because of all of those things have done to his good creation. Death is an assault on all that is good. We are not made for it. And so after being dead 4 days, Jesus approached Lazarus and he had the stone removed. And I like how the King James says it. Verse 39, Jesus said, "Take ye away the stone." Martha, the sister of him that was dead, saith unto him, "Lord, by this time he stinketh." I like that. Great translation. For he's been dead 4 days. They're like, "No, Jesus, no, hey, it's too late. We came to you 4 days ago. You couldn't get here in time. The stone's there. He stinketh. Don't go in there." Jesus insisted. He had the stone removed. And with his word, he can heal your marriage with a word. He can heal your body with a word. He can help your kids with a word. He can save the people around you with a word. In fact, he made the world with words. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word dwelt among us and became flesh. With a word, he shouted, "Lazarus, come out." And the man who died came out. His hands and feet bound with linen strips, his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many commentators comment that the reason Jesus shouted Lazarus' name so loudly is because if he just said, "Come out of that grave," then every person who was ever buried in all of history would have to rise up out of the grave in that very moment. And in fact, one day when Jesus does come back in power and glory and the last trumpet sounds, all the dead will rise in Christ because Jesus is resurrection. Can I get an amen? He came out of the tomb and they removed the stench of death that was left on his body by binding the linen wraps, which is a great picture of new life. When we come to Jesus, we all reek of death. We think that we smell good, but we actually smell like filthy rags. And when he calls our names and he says, "Come out," he invites us to leave those rags behind and to walk into a new life, which is exactly what Lazarus did. A week later, Jesus did something similar. He went to a cross. Hands were pierced, beat, mocked, spit upon, crucified. He's buried in a tomb. Everyone was wondering, "God, what's the delay? I thought we were following the Messiah. What is going on here?" Everyone was wondering, man, did we mess up? Did we get it wrong? And then 3 days later, this Easter morning, the tomb was empty. Death had been defeated, and Jesus stood before his followers alive. Easter reminds us that hope is real. Jesus comforts those who are in tough times with the promise of resurrection in this challenging world. He proves that no miracle is beyond his reach. Do you believe that in Jesus Christ, though life may be difficult, nothing is too big for him? Do you believe that here this morning in South Valley? I want to give you 3 quick ways to apply today's message. Number 1 is to reflect. I hope when you hear a sermon, when you read the word, you don't just hear it and leave, but you think. Do you believe Jesus is the resurrection and life? That's between you and him. Mom's faith doesn't apply to you. Grandpa's faith doesn't apply to you. Brother's faith doesn't apply to you. Your faith is your own faith. The line into the kingdom of heaven is single file. Do you believe Jesus is who he says he is? Have you been risen from death to life? Number 2 is to act. Shed the garments of death, embracing new life in Jesus Christ. I remember being a new Christian. I remember how much I stunk, all right? I was selfish, I was lost, I had a long list of sins and things that I really wished I didn't do, and I finally laid those things at Jesus' feet, and Jesus began to remove my garments of death and give me a new life, and so I'm reminding you today that if he's called your name, then he's called you to a new life. When he says, David, come out, he's calling you to a new life. Adrian, come out, he's calling you to a new life. Desmond, come out, he's calling you to a new life. Brittany, Tiffany, Thomas, Ricky, Blake, John, Carly, whatever your name is, when he calls your name, he calls you to leave the old life behind and to step into something more glorious. And finally, number 3, engage. Consider, here's a challenge. Who are you bringing to heaven with you? Who are you leading to Jesus? If you know the hope of being dead and then alive, who are you sharing that hope with? How does God want to use you to be a fragrance of life in a dark and dying world? Easter is a reminder. Death is defeated. The tomb is empty. Jesus Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Will you pray with me?